Now that we've looked at how rice cookers work, it's time to get back to the CED. Yes, we are now on part 5 of this 3-part series. At some point, this series will be over. Will this be the video that concludes it? Well, at the time that I'm writing these words, it looks like it, but we won't really know till we get to the end, will we? So let's not beat around the bush and get right to it. As a refresher, the CED is RCA's ultimate exercise in beating around the bush, an idea first conceived in the mid-1960s, but ultimately delayed into the 1980s, and delayed for a ton of reasons, mostly to do with mismanagement and corporate politics. I'm gonna put these away now. We left the story in the year 1976, when Edgar Griffiths, a videodisc naysayer, took the helm at RCA. Things didn't look too great for the project, especially because their Japanese competition was beginning to heat up. But let's not talk about that. Let's go back to 1974. Uh-oh, here comes a twist! Back in 1974, RCA had sent representatives to Japan to try and license their videodisc technology to Japanese manufacturers. Now, you might be saying to yourself, really? Didn't you just say something about the Japanese being competition? Wasn't it the case that they didn't have anything to do with the CED? Well, in the end, this was largely true, but initially, RCA was hoping to establish their soon-to-be-called CED as a unifying standard in the industry. They offered really generous terms to various Japanese companies, hoping that they could get lots of third parties involved and avoid a potential format war. There were a couple of big problems, though. First, these demonstrations in Japan didn't go so well. The demonstration units burned through playback styluses like there was no tomorrow, and the discs were extremely hit or miss. To those within RCA who had expressed doubts in the system, this only strengthened those doubts, and frankly, they saw the performance of the system in Japan as an embarrassment. The second big problem? Well, RCA wouldn't find out about that for a little while, but suffice it to say, they let the cat out of the bag and way too early. They weren't anywhere near done ironing out the kinks, and the Japanese knew that. Matsushita specifically expressed concerns about the disc manufacturing process, and had even suggested that RCA set up a manufacturing plant in Japan to help take care of that problem. With suggestions like that, it sure seemed like Matsushita was on RCA's side. I mean, they're being so helpful. They were among 6 companies that had taken RCA up on their incredibly generous deal. For just $3,000, RCA sold them a prototype player, sample discs, and engineering drawings. Whether this generosity was out of desperation, or whether RCA was perhaps irresponsible is unclear, but in any case, Matsushita signaled that they were all in, and they began doing their own work on the concept. We're going to return now to the year 1976, when Griffiths, who remember, did not care for this project, was now in charge of RCA at large. But one thing that you should know is that JVC, that's the Japan Victor Company, funnily enough born from the Victor Talking Machine Company and thus at one point owned by RCA, at least until World War II broke out, was at this time owned by Matsushita. Interestingly, Graham refers in her book to Matsushita as being JVC's parent company, and I'm not sure that's really the best way to put that. Wikipedia simply says they were the majority stockholder, and Panasonic's own website, Panasonic is the main consumer-facing brand of Matsushita in the US, says they formed a capital alliance with JVC in 1954. In any case, Matsushita and JVC were good buds, remember that. Up till now, RCA had learned that basically everything they were doing wasn't working. The autocoder didn't improve disk yields at all. The disks were still wicked fragile. Labs in the consumer division in Indianapolis still weren't working together all that well, and in general, it looked like Griffiths had plenty of reasons to just axe this project. This was when Griffiths commissioned that report comparing it to Betamax, which you may recall from last episode. And here's where things stood. Richard Sonnenfeld, who was the head of the videodisc project, argued that if they pulled out of videodisc, it would be strike 3 for the company. Already their image wasn't great, what with all the terrible business they had been doing, and they announced both holotape and magtape without actually delivering. If they couldn't move on this third incarnation of Selectavision, they're out. Moreover, the promises they had made to their Japanese investors were presumably still good. If they moved forward, they could get perhaps $100 million in licensing revenues. Even if the product ultimately failed, they could still have some sort of licensing from other patents. Sonnenfeld made the case that having come this far, it would be silly to quit. And he believed that, given the progress they had made, they could get it out in April of 1978. But that was still a ways off, and the Japanese were encroaching on RCA not only with video recorders, but also with consumer electronics in general. No longer was buying a color television a choice between RCA and Zenith. Now there's Sony, Panasonic, and Hitachi, among others. They were being squeezed out on all sides, and their existing dealer network was getting tired of the situation. When it came time to make the final decision, Griffiths gathered all 17 managers of the Videodisc project for a vote. Should we proceed, or should we cut our losses? The vote was 1 in favor of withdrawal, 5 abstentions, and 11 votes to continue. Griffiths agreed to keep going, but as a compromise measure, they would enter into negotiations with Sony and Matsushita to produce a videotape recorder that they could market through their dealer network. And that's how the Selectavision name ended up on VCRs from Matsushita before it ended up on their own damn product. Side note, this is unrelated to the CED story, but since it's come up in the past on this channel, I feel I can't ignore the fact that right here in this very meeting, the fate of the videotape format war was essentially sealed. Matsushita gave more favorable terms to RCA than Sony, and importantly, they went along and bodged a long-play recording mode for them, which Sony wasn't willing to do. RCA's decision to go with Matsushita and the VHS format is likely the single most important event in the entire format war. In the years that followed, Griffiths became somewhat of a convert, perhaps the result of a critical mention in a Fortune magazine article, or possibly in an effort to convince the folks at Labs that he wasn't against them. Griffiths became gung-ho on making Videodisc happen. And progress was happening. They still hadn't figured out the keys to everything, but their 1977 technical checkpoint went pretty well. Plus, they had demonstrated their system to GE, and it seemed like they might be interested in working with RCA. It began to look like maybe, just maybe, RCA could get other American companies to follow their lead. And then they returned to Japan to follow up with their partners over there when they were completely blindsided. JVC had been lurking in the background this entire time, and they had managed to create a working videodisc made without a complicated coding and mastered using a simple optical method. This disc seemed to be almost in all respects better than what RCA was working on. Some of you may have already guessed that this disc is what would eventually go on to become the VHD, or Video High Density format. This new format was very similar to the CED. In fact, one might say suspiciously similar. If you'd like to learn more about this format, you should check out Techmoan's video on it. I've linked it down below. Now, RCA was kind of forked here. You see, this new system, while pretty clearly inspired by RCA's ongoing efforts, was substantially different in many respects. This meant RCA probably couldn't get any sort of licensing revenue out of JVC, at least not anything significant. Whether or not JVC had stolen RCA's idea by way of Matsushita is unclear, but I mean, that would be one hell of a coincidence, wouldn't it? RCA had now lost not only their competitive advantage from proprietary disc mastering and manufacturing, but also any hope of unifying everyone under the same technical standard. Not good. Suddenly, it was a race against time on all sides. Sonnenfeld realized that JVC and Matsushita could just come out with a videodisc format of their own without warning. Philips MCA were now pushing DiscoVision as a consumer format, and that's looking like it's going to launch soon. And this whole time, video cassette recorders are getting super popular, and although RCA is selling tons of them, they're actually buying them from who could soon be their main competitor in the videodisc space. It's just... 1977 was the year that RCA decided they would pretty much just start over. The Labs and Consumer Division relationship was still not fantastic, and at this point the Labs were mostly cast aside. Indianapolis would now be put in charge of figuring out how to make this work, and the Labs would basically be there for support. The first task at hand was to figure out how to make the discs using JVC's techniques. You may recall that at this point, RCA was using injection molding for the discs, which is not how conventional audio records are produced. JVC's videodisc prototype used plain, uncoated, stamped discs, and RCA recognized this was a better and more cost-effective idea. So, if JVC had stolen their basic concept, well, now RCA stole their improvements, so I guess they're even now. The switch to conventional record stamping was not only simpler, but also just worked better. Disk yields were way up, and equipment costs and complexity were way down. Perhaps they should have thought to try that themselves, like forever ago. They also developed the electromechanical mastering process, which also is incidentally pretty much exactly how conventional audio record stampers are produced. They also switched to a diamond stylus from the Safar that they had been using, and this increased playback stylus life tenfold. Okay, I need to interject here with some commentary. 1977 was the year this finally started to come together, and yet all these breakthroughs were hardly breakthroughs at all. Now sure, I'm oversimplifying, but honestly, everything that just happened could be boiled down to, well, what if we just tried making discs like audio records? And what if we just tried a diamond stylus like many record players have? Treating the CED like the glorified audio record it was fixed a lot of problems. Sure, they needed to innovate some of the specifics, and coming up with the actual formulation of PVC which would allow the disc to be conductive was an entirely new innovation, in my eyes. But seriously, so much progress was made in this 1 year by attacking the problem with already existing techniques. To me, this is the biggest piece of evidence that the labs was arguably more of a hindrance than they were a resource. Given that the people working there liked to research shiny new phenomena and publish their findings, it seems pretty unlikely that anyone there would have said, well, what if we just iterated on the technology we already understand? In fact, we know this wasn't their cup of tea, given how everyone there flocked to holotape rather than what would become the CED. This rapid progress didn't happen until Indianapolis was given the lead, and the pressure of restricted budgets caused them to consider tried and true methods of the past. And these happened to work. And really well. This just goes to show that a bunch of bright minds in one place isn't necessarily a recipe for success unless they're working towards a common goal. The labs didn't see themselves as working on the video disc. They were a research institution, and everyone in the labs had their own pet projects, so of course they were going to push for those to be incorporated into whatever the consumer divisions were working on. It took me until I reread this section of the book to realize how absurdly complicated some of their ideas were. What place do electron beams have in making a disc stamper? Why the hell wouldn't you just do what you've been doing for decades and physically cut the master? Well, unless somebody asks that question, nobody's gonna try. And if your job is to think up new things, you're probably not gonna ask that question. The people in Indianapolis weren't trying to blow the minds of the world with new discoveries. They were just trying to make the damn product work. And once they were given the lead, suddenly a lot of pieces fell into place. Funny what can happen when your division shares a common goal. If 1977 was the year of figuring out the obvious, 1978 was the year of let's get going, shall we? As predicted, Matsushita decided that they would rather back this new thing JVC was working on, so there went any hope of having them as a partner. Adding to that pain was the fact that currency fluctuations now meant RCA couldn't make much money on the VCRs they were importing from Matsushita, and their hopes of importing Japan-made videodisc players of their own format pretty much dried up. It became clear that if this system was to have any chance of success, RCA would just have to do it themselves. And so, they did. Now that they had, a plan, laboratories came back into the fold to work on specifics, like figuring out how to mass-produce components and whatnot. And Indianapolis played a bigger role than ever. The various pilot tests that they had done over the years were always being handled by a scrappy team at the Rockland Road facility, and now that team would grow to about 300 people in preparation for the launch. Luckily, this went pretty smoothly, all things considered, thanks to the fact that they had cracked the code using nothing but modified record stamping equipment. It wasn't that hard to procure the equipment and start production. Plenty of companies made that sort of stuff. If only they hadn't been trying to reinvent the wheel for the past decade! The new conductive PVC formulation eliminated the need for the autocoder, which had caused tremendous problems in each pilot program. And really, all they needed to do now was get a catalog of programs ready to go and start pumping out players and discs. Unfortunately, the stars were not aligned. Before launch, video discs were getting bad press thanks to reliability problems with the early Discovision players. And the economy was heading into a recession. And GE announced that they intended to back JVC's system. And IBM had backed Discovision. And video cassette recorders were getting cheaper and were selling like hotcakes. And nobody wanted to work with RCA. So alone, battered, and afraid, the system finally launched in March of 1981, to little fanfare. Of course, RCA would add their own fanfare in 1982. But that wouldn't help. Not even RCA's dealers were interested in pushing this product, as they had had their hands full with VCRs for the past 4 years. 2/3 of the dealers who had signed on to sell the videodisc had backed out, and that alone may have been enough to seal its fate. But even had that not happened, it's important to remember that the VCR was in nearly every respect a better, more capable, and more convenient product. The only advantage RCA had with their videodisc was cost, but that would only remain true if the consumer attitude was to A, see no reason to record live TV, and B, wanted to buy lots of pre-recorded content. And of course, the thing that RCA didn't see coming was rental. I went over this in much greater detail in my series on Laserdisc, but an important thing to consider here is that RCA developed this product before home video existed as a concept. You could argue they were trying to invent that concept, but unfortunately they were catastrophically late. If the CED had managed to be on the market before the VCR had made much headway, I'd wager that it would have been tremendously successful. If they had made even their 1977 deadline, the choice would have been between a $400 machine with $15 movies and a $1,300 machine which could record live TV. That makes the value proposition of the CED player much more compelling. But by 1981, not only had people been watching the price of VCRs steadily decrease through 4 years of intense competition, but they could also witness this home video rental market start to appear. Now, if they bought one of these VCRs, they would not only be able to record live TV, but they'd have access to a large library of content. And sure, mass-producing pre-recorded videocassettes was a slow and expensive process, but who cares if a videotape of your favorite movie costs $75 to buy if you can rent it for $3? Also of note is the fact that you could get practically anything on videocassette, but your choices on CED were limited to what RCA could cobble together. They struggled to provide a wide library of programming, and since relatively few people bought the machines, even though disc sales exceeded expectations, they could never justify expanding production all that much. To their credit though, they did manage to have a remarkably large library when you consider only 500,000 players ever existed. But there was still a lot they just couldn't offer. And, well, one of the things they didn't offer was, shall we say, mature content. Graham mentions this mostly in passing as an example of the lack of programming variety, and I don't believe she's suggesting that this would have saved the videodisc. And hey, before this gets brought up, because of course it will now that I've said this, porn existed on beta tapes, okay? That whole explanation of Beta losing the format war because Sony wouldn't allow porn is nothing but an urban legend. And we know this because not only was there Beta in the back room, but because Sony didn't have control over what was being put on their tapes. Neither Betamax nor VHS were created to sell content. Let me repeat that. Neither Beta nor VHS were created to sell content. JVC and Sony weren't in the distribution business, and they were not greenlighting anything at all. I'm only bringing this up because RCA was in the distribution business, and it is the case that RCA was unwilling to put their name on naughty movies. And since they were distributing literally all of the content available for their players, the only way we'd have gotten that kind of disc picks would be if third-party manufacturers appeared. Which of course didn't happen because the volumes just weren't there. This almost makes me wonder if the origins of that VHS myth might be traced back to the CED, because that story is what literally happened in the case of RCA. The real head-scratcher about the entire CED ordeal is the why. Why did RCA continue with this in the face of so much competition? Why did they think it could work? Well, that's a complicated issue. In many respects, the CED's role in the company continually shifted. Conceived as the sequel to color television, Selectavision would have undoubtedly been tremendously successful had it been released in the 1960s. But that didn't happen, and in the meantime, priorities at RCA had changed. Consumer electronics had stopped being the primary business by the time David Sarnoff had stepped down. The diversification into computers and, of course, all the other businesses that they had been gobbling up under Robert Sarnoff's questionable leadership meant Selectavision was now just one of many projects going on. And since Labs was allowed to pursue 3 different methods at once, and the consumer divisions were also just doing their own thing with MagTape, there was never a real coordinated effort to make it work. So it just floundered in the background forever. By the time RCA had become refocused on their goals after their computer division sell-off, it was arguably too late already. Real progress didn't happen until VCRs were already on the market. And the sad irony is that RCA knew they couldn't afford to ignore that, hence the deal with Matsushita. If there's one thing I can glean from this situation, it's that the CED was viewed as a last hurrah, a chance to return RCA to its roots of a consumer electronics powerhouse and to open up new business as a new kind of media company. Not television, but Selectavision. Of course, it failed catastrophically. In the very beginning, RCA had made a series of key assumptions that, if held true, would probably mean the success of the CED. These were that consumers would prefer a lower price to more features, that potential format confusion could be alleviated by their dealers, and most importantly, that videocassette recorders would remain expensive because economies of scale apparently don't apply to magnetic tape for some reason. And also, of course, that consumers would want to own a library of video, just as they had amassed their libraries of music on LPs. Nobody ever challenged these assumptions, and that was quite foolish. In 1972, those assumptions would almost certainly hold up, and perhaps they still rang true in 1977. But RCA seemed unwilling to acknowledge the changing landscape. Consumer electronics was starting to become the way it is today, with intense competition pushing the boundaries of features and price at an incredible pace. It seems RCA was just unaware of this new reality. 4 years wasn't a long time to wait in the 1960s, but by the late 70s it certainly was. Yet, they still tried. In summary, a bunch of things doomed this poor product. The free rein that Labs was given to just do whatever with little regard to practical matters prevented progress from ever being truly coordinated, as did the general resentment of the Labs by other departments. So years passed without anything to really show for it. Then, RCA had lost their way under Robert Sarnoff and just kinda stopped innovating altogether for a while. And by the time Griffiths was in charge, they had just kind of forgotten how to innovate. Griffiths made an earnest attempt in the late 70s to take RCA back to its roots and become a true innovator once more. He brought back the "His Master's Voice" tagline, long ago abandoned, and he really tried to get RCA's reputation back on good footing. And I think it says a lot that real progress was made once the folks in Indianapolis were essentially leading the project. That team over there worked like RCA of old, and they actually got results. It was just too late to make much of a difference. RCA had a lot of debt to cover by the time 1984 rolled around. The CED had failed spectacularly, so there goes any chance of this covering it, and while they did have some strategies going for how to get out of that debt, in the end they just couldn't make it. GE bought what was left in 1986 and sold off many of those assets in the years to come. Given how it panned out, the CED literally was RCA's last hurrah. Is the failure of the CED what ultimately killed RCA? Well, not from a pure numbers sense, no. There were far too many things going on at RCA for the failure of one product to sink the ship, but I think it's fair to say it was the final nail in the coffin. A lot was riding on the success of the CED, literally the entire company. Had it gone according to plan, I think RCA would still be around. But let's be honest, it needed to be out about 6 years earlier if it were really going to work. Well, that's it. We've finished the series, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'd like to mention here that RCA is dead, but the brand lives on as one of those brands that doesn't actually mean anything at all. You might find an RCA branded whatever on store shelves, but let's be real, it's probably crap. Maybe you'll find the odd gem here and there, but seriously, it's not like the legacy of David Sarnoff lives on in this countertop dishwasher. Oh, and one other thing. While this officially ends the series, it was suggested to me that I could follow up on some of the unanswered questions you may have regarding this disastrous format. For example, some people have wondered if you can insert the disc into the caddy upside down. Well, you can. At the edge of the spine, there's a little side indicator, so that is really what tells you which side is which. I would imagine most people were careful to make the sides match the label, but there is indeed nothing stopping you from putting the caddy in upside down. If there's anything you'd like to know about the CED that I haven't covered, please leave a comment. Of course, a huge thank you to the people who support this channel through Patreon. Without your support, I couldn't spend so much time on big long series like this, so thank you. You can join these folks if you like through the link on the end screen or in the description. Thanks for your consideration, and I'll see you next time. We are done! This series is over! Yeah! No. Hoping that they could sell Well, in the end, this was largely true. But initially, why did I say largely like that? They offered really generous terms to various Japanese companies, hoping... This is not going well! It's gonna take forever! I have to get the book, which I left upstairs. Hang on. Got it. Side note, this is unrelated to the CED story, but since it comes up in the... Since it's come up, it's, as in it has. Disk yields were way up and equipment? And importantly, they went along and made for them... Skipped a line. The various but that would only remain true if consumer attitudes were to A... What was that line? That would only remain true if the consumer attitude, okay. Griffiths is a hard name to say. You can join these folks if you like through the link in the end screen or on, through the link in the end, you can join these folks if you like through the link in the end, on the end screen! In the description. You can join these folks if you like through the link in the end screen.